September 16, 1922. The bodies of two lovers are discovered beneath a crab apple tree on an abandoned farm in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Their deaths will captivate a nation, expose the dark underbelly of respectable society, and remain one of America's most notorious unsolved murders. This is the story of the Hall Mills case. It begins on a Saturday morning. A young couple out for a stroll on De Russey's Lane, a lonely dirt road on the outskirts of town, stumble upon something that will haunt them forever. The bodies lie side by side in a grotesque tableau. Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, 41 years old, minister of the prestigious Episcopal Church of St. John the Evangelist. And beside him, Eleanor Mills, 34, a soprano in his church choir. Both have been shot in the head. The scene is carefully arranged, almost theatrical. The Reverend's calling card rests against his foot. Love letters are scattered around the bodies like fallen leaves. Mrs. Mills's throat has been slashed so savagely that her head is nearly severed. One detail will capture the public's morbid fascination: the letters have been torn to pieces and strewn across the victims, as if someone wanted the world to know exactly why these two people died. But let's go back. Back to the days before the bodies were found, when two people from vastly different worlds were conducting a love affair that would cost them everything. Edward Wheeler Hall cut an impressive figure in New Brunswick society. Tall, distinguished, with a warm speaking voice that commanded attention from the pulpit. He had married Frances Noel Stevens 7 years earlier, a union that made sense on paper, if nowhere else. Frances came from one of the wealthiest families in New Jersey. The Stevens family owned property throughout the state. They moved in the highest circles. Frances herself was plain, 7 years older than Edward, and completely devoted to him. By all accounts, it was a marriage of convenience that had grown into something resembling companionship, if not passion. Eleanor Mills was something else entirely. She was the wife of James Mills, the church sexton, a janitor, essentially. They lived modestly in a small house with their teenage daughter. Eleanor had a beautiful voice that soared during Sunday services, and she had something else, a vivacious personality that drew people to her. She was warm where Frances was reserved, emotional where Frances was stoic. When exactly the affair between Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills began, no one could say for certain. But by the summer of 1922, it was the worst-kept secret in New Brunswick. The letters found at the murder scene would later be read aloud in court, and they were extraordinary. Eleanor wrote to Edward with an abandon that shocked the buttoned-up society of the 1920s. She called him her babykins. She wrote of their meetings, their embraces, their plans to somehow, someday, be together openly. "I know there are girls with more shapely bodies," one letter read, "but I do not care what they have. I have the greatest of all blessings, the deep, true, and eternal love of a noble man." Edward's letters to Eleanor were fewer, but they revealed a man torn between duty and desire. He called her his heart's desire and spoke of the agony of their situation. In the weeks before the murders, tensions were escalating in both households. Frances Stevens Hall was no fool. She knew her husband was infatuated with the choir singer. But Frances came from a world where such matters were handled discreetly, where appearances mattered more than truth. Divorce was unthinkable, a scandal that would destroy Edward's career and her family's reputation. James Mills, Eleanor's husband, claimed he knew nothing of the affair. Many found this impossible to believe. He worked at the church. He saw his wife and the minister together constantly. But James Mills presented himself as a simple man, devoted to his wife, blindly trusting. Whether he was truly ignorant or merely playing a role would become one of the central questions of the case. The last week of their lives, Edward and Eleanor threw caution to the wind. They were seen together frequently, walking, talking, obviously intimate. On Thursday, September 14, Eleanor told a friend that she had important news, something that would change everything. She wouldn't say what. That same day, Edward Hall seemed agitated, distracted. He cancelled appointments. He told his wife he had church business to attend to that evening. This is where the story becomes murky, where facts give way to conflicting testimonies and convenient amnesias. Thursday evening, September 14, 1922. Around 7:30, Edward Hall leaves his home, telling Frances he's going out on church business. He'll be back later. Eleanor Mills tells her husband she's going out for a walk. She takes no coat, though the September evening is cool. What happens next depends on who you ask. According to later testimony, Frances Hall became suspicious. Some said she followed her husband. Others said she stayed home. Her account would change, evolve, become more elaborate with each telling. 2 witnesses would later come forward, a pig farmer named Clifford Hayes and his wife, who lived near de Russey's Lane. They claimed they heard shots around 10:30 that night. A woman screaming. Then silence. But they didn't report it. Not for days. Another witness, Jane Gibson, a woman who would become known to history as the Pig Woman, told an even more dramatic story. She claimed she was out late that night searching for thieves who had been stealing from her farm. She rode her mule down de Russey's Lane and witnessed the murders. She saw 4 people, she said. A woman with white hair who said, "Explain these letters." Shots fired. Screaming. Then the killers fled, and Jane Gibson, terrified, rode home in silence. For 2 days, she said nothing. When the bodies were discovered on Saturday morning, September 16, the investigation that followed was a masterclass in incompetence. The crime scene was trampled by curiosity seekers. Hundreds of people walked through the area before police could secure it. Evidence was contaminated, moved, or pocketed as souvenirs. The love letters were picked up, read, and passed around before investigators could properly catalog them. No fingerprints were taken. No photographs of the bodies in their original positions. The autopsy was perfunctory at best. Within hours, the story had leaked to the press, and New Brunswick was under siege. Reporters descended from New York, Philadelphia, Boston. This had everything newspapers loved: sex, scandal, murder, and high society brought low. The investigation focused immediately on the obvious suspects, the 2 surviving spouses. Frances Stevens Hall was a wealthy, connected woman with a powerful motive. If her husband had been planning to leave her for Eleanor Mills, to throw away his position, her money, her family's name for a church janitor's wife, she had every reason to want them both dead. James Mills, the cuckolded husband, also had motive. If he had finally learned of the affair, if his masculine pride had been wounded beyond bearing, he might have snapped. But there was no physical evidence linking either of them to the crime scene. And both had alibis, weak ones, perhaps, but alibis nonetheless. Frances Hall didn't face this ordeal alone. She had her family, the Stevens clan, and they circled the wagons. Her brother, Willie Stevens, became a figure of intense scrutiny. Willie was an odd duck, a middle-aged bachelor who lived with his mother and sister, who was interested in natural history and bugs, who had never held a job. Some said he was mentally slow. Others said he was eccentric but harmless. Willie Stevens claimed he was home the night of the murders, reading. But he had no one to corroborate his story. Frances's cousin, Henry Stevens, was a successful marksman, a man who knew his way around firearms. He claimed he was out of town the night of September 14. But could he prove it? The press began to paint a picture of a powerful family closing ranks, using their wealth and influence to obstruct justice. The Stevens family hired the best lawyers money could buy. They issued carefully worded statements. They suggested alternative theories. Maybe it was a robbery gone wrong. Maybe Eleanor Mills had other lovers, other jealous admirers. Maybe James Mills was more involved than he admitted. The public watched, fascinated and horrified, as New Jersey society turned on itself. The investigation stalled. Weeks passed, then months. No arrests were made. The district attorney's office seemed paralyzed. Then, 4 years later, everything changed. In 1926, new evidence emerged, or rather, old evidence was suddenly remembered. Jane Gibson, the pig woman, came forward with her story of witnessing the murders. She had been silent, she said, because she was afraid of the powerful Stevens family. Now she was dying of cancer and wanted to tell the truth. Her testimony was sensational. She described the scene in vivid detail, Mrs. Hall confronting the lovers, demanding explanations. Willie Stevens mumbling incoherently. Henry Stevens holding a gun. The shots, the screaming, the chaos. It was exactly what prosecutors needed. Frances Stevens Hall, her brother Willie, and her cousin Henry were arrested and charged with murder. November 1926. The trial began in Somerville, New Jersey, and it was unlike anything America had seen before. The circus had come to town. Hundreds of reporters covered the trial. Radio stations broadcast updates. Crowds lined up for hours hoping to get a seat in the courtroom. Movie producers sent representatives, already planning adaptations. The prosecution built their case on motive and the testimony of Jane Gibson. They portrayed Frances Hall as a woman scorned, driven to murder by humiliation and rage. Willie Stevens as her strange, devoted brother who would do anything she asked. Henry Stevens as the enforcer, the one who pulled the trigger. The love letters were read aloud in court, every intimate detail exposed. Eleanor Mills's daughter wept. The spectators gasped and whispered. But the defense was formidable. They had studied the case for 4 years. They were ready. They attacked Jane Gibson's credibility mercilessly. She was a woman of questionable reputation, they said. She had changed her story multiple times. She was dying and desperate for attention, possibly hoping for a book deal or movie rights. They brought her into court on a hospital bed, a theatrical moment that backfired. Instead of looking brave and determined, she appeared confused, contradicting herself under cross-examination. The defense produced witnesses who provided alibis for the accused. They suggested James Mills was the real killer, a man who had finally learned of the affair and taken terrible revenge, then cleverly deflected suspicion onto the wealthy family. They pointed out the sloppy investigation, the contaminated crime scene, the lack of physical evidence. How could anyone be convicted on such flimsy grounds? Willie Stevens turned out to be the defense's secret weapon. When he took the stand, the prosecution expected to break him easily, this strange, sheltered man with his unusual mannerisms and interests. Instead, Willie Stevens was calm, articulate, and utterly convincing. He spoke about his interest in natural history, his quiet life at home with his mother and sister. He accounted for his movements on the night of September 14, 1922, with remarkable detail. He had been home, reading and cataloging his collection. He remembered precisely what he had been reading, a book about fungi. Under brutal cross-examination, he never wavered. His answers were thoughtful, intelligent, occasionally even witty. The jury watched him, and whatever picture they had formed of a sinister family conspiracy began to crumble. Frances Hall never testified. Her lawyers wouldn't allow it. She sat in court day after day, composed and dignified, showing no emotion even when the most intimate details of her husband's affair were discussed. After 18 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for 5 hours. Not guilty. All 3 defendants were acquitted on all charges. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, believing justice had been served. Others protested, convinced that wealth and power had once again bought freedom. Frances Stevens Hall walked out of the courthouse a free woman. She would never speak publicly about the case again. The Hall Mills murder case faded from the headlines, but it never truly disappeared. Frances Hall returned to her mansion and lived there for the rest of her life, a recluse. Willie Stevens continued his quiet existence, tending to his collections. Henry Stevens returned to his successful career. James Mills moved away from New Brunswick, trying to escape the shadow of that September night. Jane Gibson, the pig woman, died shortly after the trial, taking whatever truth she knew to her grave. Over the years, theories multiplied. Some believed Frances Hall was guilty but had been acquitted due to the weakness of the evidence. Others thought the Ku Klux Klan, which was active in New Jersey at the time, might have been involved, punishing an immoral minister and his paramour. Still others suspected James Mills, believing his act of ignorance was just that, an act. And some thought the murders were the work of someone else entirely, perhaps one of Eleanor Mills's other admirers, or a random act of violence that was given meaning only by the scandal of the affair. The truth? We'll never know for certain. The Hall Mills case remains significant not just because of its sensational elements, but because of what it revealed about American society in the 1920s. This was the Jazz Age, when old Victorian values were colliding with new freedoms. When the respectable facade of the upper classes was cracking. When the press discovered that scandal sold papers better than anything else. The case exposed the class divisions that ran through American life, wealthy Frances Hall on one side, working-class Eleanor Mills on the other, with Reverend Hall caught between two worlds. It showed how the justice system could be influenced by wealth and social position, how evidence could be mishandled, how public opinion could shift and change based on courtroom theatrics rather than facts. And it gave America a mystery that would endure for generations. Somewhere on the outskirts of New Brunswick, New Jersey, now covered by suburban development, is the site where two lovers met their end beneath a crab-apple tree. The tree is long gone. The dirt road has been paved over. But the story remains. Who killed Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills? Was it a woman scorned? A husband betrayed? The loyal brother? A random killer? Or perhaps, in the end, they were killed by the very thing that brought them together, a love that defied the rules of their time, in a society that could not forgive such transgressions.